Paris is known as the City of Love and the City of Light. It's famous as a city of culture and romance. It's also famous for making Japanese visitors depressed. Let's explore Paris together and learn more about the Paris syndrome. I'm on a day trip to Paris, and I look forward to seeing all the monuments and places that I've read about and seen in movies. The Eiffel Tower, Champs-Élysées, the Louvre, and the Notre Dame as well. I have a mental image of cozy cafes and people drinking wine in the sun, of lovers taking walks hand in hand along the beautiful river Seine. I also have a mental image of French people wearing berets and carrying baguettes everywhere, but I'd better not say that out loud. But is Paris really like that? Is it full of cozy and romantic spots everywhere? Or is it just a big European city full of dirt and grime and stressed out people, just like everywhere else? That leads us to the main point of the Paris syndrome. In 1986, a Japanese psychiatrist named Hiroaki Ota was working in France, and he encountered many Japanese tourists who had mental breakdowns when visiting Paris. He released a book called Paris Shokugun that was translated to English as The Paris Syndrome, in which he describes the cause of these breakdowns. Paris gets around 1 million Japanese visitors every year, and many of these visitors have a very romantic view of the city. Paris is imagined to be a city of extraordinary culture and extraordinary beauty. The cobbled streets are supposed to be the most charming places in the world, and the people are supposed to be the most beautiful and the most fashionable. Then they come here and reality kicks in. Maybe they encounter a really rude taxi driver, or maybe they get yelled at by an arrogant waiter. To people in the West, that doesn't really sound all that bad. It's pretty much what we expect when we come to Paris. But to a Japanese person, that's an enormous shock. Everyone knows that the Japanese are very polite. They're pleasant and smiling, and they say thank you. But it goes far beyond that. Politeness in Japan is synonymous with respect. Japanese culture is very collectivist, and they put the needs of others first. Giving someone else the biggest piece of the cake, or the best seat in the restaurant, or helping in any other way they can, is completely natural. Japanese people show respect by being polite to each other. It's unthinkable to yell at another person. And selfish behavior is just not part of the mentality, unless you're a completely uncivilized person. You've all heard stories about Japanese people cleaning hotel rooms before they check out, or taking away trash when they visit a place. Leaving a place in a better shape than when you got there is a very Japanese thing. Seeing a place where people are loud and rude and there's trash on the streets is an extreme culture shock to Japanese people. But why is this syndrome called the Paris syndrome and not the London or Rome syndrome? The Japanese have a fascination for French culture and French aesthetics. The Baroque style is something that has appealed to Japanese tastes. There's a visual tape band called Versailles, for example, showing a pretty idealized version of French aesthetics. Parts of the kawaii culture of Japan is also heavily influenced by French looks. Big hair, pink, pastel colors, floral prints, and so on. It seems like a lot of Japan's fascination with France dates back to pop culture from the early 1900s. America was a big influence on Japan during that time, but also France. In the 1920s and 30s, a lot of movies in Japanese top lists were French movies. European music was also more popular in Japan than American music during that time, especially French music. Also, Japanese people had a very hard time traveling abroad in the post-1945 era. It wasn't until the mid-60s that Japanese tourists were able to freely travel abroad again. And by then, visiting Europe, and Paris in particular, became the ultimate status symbol for the Japanese. Paris appears to give the Japanese a sense of romantic nostalgia, an idealized version of a beautiful and romantic city forever frozen in time. The problem is that Paris has evolved, just like every modern city. By the way, I've seen two different people come walking with baguettes under their arms, so there's some truth to the cliché. No berets though, not yet at least. Some people have criticized the Paris syndrome and claimed that it might not be a proper syndrome at all, it could all just be common culture shock. Common symptoms of culture shock are homesickness, depression, anxiety, and irritation. Culture shock comes from not being prepared for what to expect from the destination you're visiting, and it's very common. For most people it goes away over time, but it can take a long time, weeks or even months. There are many documented cases of the Paris syndrome, so no one is questioning whether or not Japanese people are actually suffering from the effects. The thing that's more questionable is whether or not it's really any different from the culture shock that, for example, Americans can get. One thing that strikes me is that it takes time to get over culture shock, but how often do you give something a second chance when the first experience was truly terrible? Maybe Japanese people could grow to love the modern Paris if they simply gave it a little bit more time. But it's hard to blame them if they decide to never come back here again. I can only imagine how depressed I would be if I were transported to a fantasy world only to discover that it's dull and dirty and that magic is completely overrated. Come to think of it, that actually sounds like an interesting concept for an isekai anime. It would be like the fantasy version of the Paris syndrome. You heard it here first. If you ever see something like that, they took my idea. When I first read about the Paris syndrome, I imagined that it's something affecting thousands of people every year. Every Japanese tourist who comes here would fall down sobbing on his knees, or something like that. But it's not really that bad. Around 20 people per year are affected. And it's often women in their 30s who are most affected. The people who idolize Paris just a little bit more than everyone else. I've seen articles online describe it as a first-class problem for a first-class vacation, comparing it to the 21st century gout. It's definitely a problem, but it's a little bit too privileged to be taken seriously. And it's easy to feel that way when you read about the Paris syndrome. It sounds a bit silly, a little bit naive. But say that to the dozens of people who get panic attacks and end up asking for help at the Japanese embassy. It's probably not silly for them at least. Almost 20% of all Google reviews of Paris are negative according to a study. It's the most disappointing of all major cities. Hong Kong is also up there with a 15.9% disapproval rating, but it's not as bad as Paris. However, Stockholm had a positive rating. Just saying. There's a lot to be disappointed with in Paris. The traffic, the snooty Parisians, the Mona Lisa. But for me, that doesn't feel like a major culture shock. But then again, I don't really have a view of Paris as a romantic city of love or a city of light. It's a big and fascinating city with a lot of amazing things to see. But it's just a city like so many others. I should be able to relate with the Japanese though, since Sweden is also a pretty polite country. Getting yelled at or being confronted is something that gives most Swedes a minor heart attack. And we love our clean cities in Sweden. Paris isn't really as clean as Stockholm. But Sweden doesn't romanticize France, even though we imported our king from here in the 1800s. France is a fine country, and Paris is a lovely city, but Swedes don't expect it to be filled with light and romance and wonder. And maybe that's a little bit sad, really. I kinda like the idealized version of Paris that maybe only exists in the expectations of the Japanese. And that's about it for this very quick look at Paris and the Paris syndrome. I hope you found it interesting. Like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day. Before you go, have a look at this video as well. I have a hunch that you're gonna find it interesting.